So how many of you played the game telephone as a child? All right, I see some folks who have their hands down. So for those who've not heard of it before, the game is simple. You sit or you stand in a circle or a line with a group of your friends. One person will think up a word or a sentence, the more complex the better, and whisper it to the next person in line, only once. That person must relay what they think they heard to the next person down the line, who will do the same to the next person, and so on and so forth, until the last person in line is reached. And then the last person in line will share with the whole group what they think they heard, which is most often very different from what the first person said. This is a game that's often used in classrooms to teach children both listening skills and honesty. And our passage today from the first letter to the Thessalonians reads very much like the end of a game of telephone. Paul founded the church at Thessalonica and was with them for about 4 months, but he was then abruptly expelled from the city. So the Thessalonians, since that time, have been teaching each other from what they remember of what Paul said. And some things have gotten garbled in the process. And one garble in particular is causing this community much pain and grief. In the early church, and I mean the early church, this is circa 50 CE, so this is the earliest Christian writing in the Bible. Many people believed that Christ's return was imminent. And when I say imminent, I mean don't buy any more flour because Christ might come back. Even Paul, in his letters, articulates this clear expectation that the second coming will take place before he dies. So given this, the Thessalonians have come to the not unreasonable conclusion that none of their members of their church would die before Christ came back. So when deaths did inevitably occur, the members of the church became afraid that in dying before Jesus came back, their loved ones had missed out on a chance at eternal life. This confusion, in the words of one commentator, has resulted in grief and distress inappropriate for Christians. Before I go further, let me stop and address that statement. So when Paul exhorts the Thessalonians not to grieve like those who have no hope, we in the white Western church have all too often heard him say, Christians should not grieve. That is not what is happening here. Even Jesus weeps when he hears about the death of his friend Lazarus, and we're going to talk more about that next week. Our text, unfortunately, fails to address how cultural norms around grief differ from place to place and culture to culture. Paul, for example, as a Jew, would have had very different ideas around what proper mourning meant than the mostly Gentile church at Thessalonica. In some cultures, crying and lamenting is such a core part of grief that you could then, and sometimes still can, hire professionals to sing dirges or wail as the body is interred at your funeral. In others, corpses are kept in the home for a period of time after death and treated as though they are still alive. And if this is a topic of interest to you, I highly recommend Caitlin Doty's excellent book, From Here to Eternity. But the Christian community at this point in their history is so new that they don't have cultural norms around death yet. So Paul, being Paul, he decides it's time to create some. He describes God coming down from heaven and the dead rising up to meet God in the air before being joined by those who are still alive. And this vision is beautiful because in it, no one is left out or left behind. You don't have to buy your way in. You don't have to do the right things at the right time. There's no bribe that will get you there. You simply have to believe. Now, Paul in this passage does such a wonderfully succinct job of trying to explain the unexplainable that these verses are the basis for many of our creeds. You will see words from this passage in 1 Thessalonians in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. We still regard this as the basis of what our belief is for the afterlife. These verses are also the source of much of the theology around the rapture. Anybody in here read the Left Behind books? Okay. We only had about 50,000 copies in the church library, but I think those have mostly been purged. But the idea behind the rapture is that faithful Christians will be caught up to heaven ahead of the tribulations preceding the second coming. But I want to be careful to note here that although the idea of rapture has gotten a lot of popular press, it's just one of many ideas around the second coming. Paul has given us poetry, these beautiful, succinct images. And in our haste to try and lock something down, something concrete about what will happen in life after death, we have turned this poetry into production directions for the halftime show at the Super Bowl. We have taken something that is meant to give us mental ideas of what might happen and turned it into, this is exactly how it's going to work. Paul isn't trying to do that. Paul is providing pastoral care for a community that is experiencing deep pain and suffering. 50 CE is about the time where Christians were starting to be persecuted in the church. So it's likely that some or all of the deaths in the church at Thessalonica had directly to do with that persecution. And in their suffering, the community has tried to deal with their grief by misplacing it into a theological argument over who does and does not get to experience the second coming. I'm sure none of you have ever been to a funeral where somebody in the family has decided that, for example, what kind of flowers are on the casket spray are going to determine whether or not their family member gets into heaven. I'm sure you have never been to a wedding where the bride has decided that if one of the 50 handmade centerpieces is out of space, then they might as well not get married. We've all been in that space of stress and anger, and we don't do good things when we're in it. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility at all that the Thessalonians, in sending Paul these questions, are really just kind of grasping at straws. And Paul gives them something different. He doesn't try to logic them out of their grief. He gives them hope. Hope in this beautiful, poetic imagery to see their loved ones again at the second coming. What he's doing here is he's providing a new way for the community to relate to those who are no longer present with them. And that reconfiguration of the bonds that tie us to our loved ones is the hardest task for those who grieve. How does the world go on when my loved one is no longer here? Why did they die this way? What does that mean for what I believe about a just and fair and merciful God? But I want to circle back to one other question, which is, why was the community at Thessalonica caught off guard by death in the first place? Of course, it is possible that they weren't caught off guard so much as overwhelmed by death, beginning to understand what persecution meant for the first time. The Thessalonians, as a group, are coming to terms with what that persecution means for them individually. Now, we all know that it's one thing to kind of feel your knees go weak as you watch somebody skydive out of an airplane. It's a whole other thing to stand at the door yourself and feel the air rushing by you and know that your life now depends on a thin nylon string. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s came out with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We hear about those a lot, but what you don't often hear reminded is that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us these 5 stages of grief not as part of how we grieve for others, but as how we process our own impending mortality. Confronting the realities of death is a task that Christians are called to perform on a regular basis throughout our lives. The first way we often do this is through the deaths of relatives and friends. I remember vividly being a 6-year-old at my grandmother's funeral and reaching out to touch her face as she sat in the open casket, which freaked out every single adult in the room. That was just as true for ancient Thessalonica as it is today. If we imagine the holy procession being caught up into the air that Paul paints for us, we could note that the first wave of people, if we portrayed them looking as they did when they died, would include a high proportion of people whose lives have been tragically cut short. Far more numerous would have been the people who had died as infants or in stillbirths, as small children, as women in childbirth, as impoverished, malnourished non-elites, and as people enslaved. This kind of reality that the last truly shall be first, even in this great upheaval of death, is the easiest to ignore and overlook, and to our shame, we often do just that. How many times have we sat with someone who was recently bereaved and been afraid to speak the name of the person who has died? We all have that conversation from time to time because we're scared of what we might unleash. We are uncomfortable with grief, and so we set it aside. And in doing so, we leave people to process that grief on their own. But there are other ways that deaths confront us that are harder to ignore. We are called to care for loved ones, parents, relatives, and friends as they develop degenerative or terminal conditions. And then, of course, there is the long process of watching our own bodies and minds begin to fail with age and disease. Yet, even in the midst of these, instead of confronting the realities of death and decay, we choose to bury our heads in the sand. I cannot count how many times as a hospital chaplain and then as a pastor, I have been asked for referrals for lawyers so that people who are literally on their deathbeds can make the wills that they did not think were necessary right up until that moment. I cannot count the number of families who have found themselves navigating the complexities of probate court because even when a will was made, the person who was dying did not take time, sometimes over years, to put a signature to the paper. And still greater than these are the families that I have walked alongside as they have been thrown into making life-altering or life-ending decisions for their loved ones who did not discuss their own preferences with their families ahead of time and are no longer able to decide for themselves. If you take only one thing away from this sermon, if you do only one thing as a result of sitting here for this hour today, here is what I say. Here is what I beg you to do. Talk to your families, your friends, and your loved ones about what you want when you are old and when you die. Do it early and do it often, because as the parable of the 10 bridesmaids teaches us, the master may come at any moment for you. To hope in God is to be constantly ready for the next great adventure, even and especially the one that takes us beyond the veil that separates this world from the next. Paul ends this portion of the letter with a command and an exhortation. Encourage one another with these words. So how do we encourage others as we confront the reality that we will die someday? First, let's remember that death is not only our enemy, but God's. Notice I didn't say that grief is the enemy. And we so often treat one another like grief is the enemy. But death itself is the enemy. We follow a God who grieves alongside us as Jesus did for Lazarus, but who is also working constantly to overturn the systems of death and destruction that we face. Death is not only our enemy. Second, I hope that we can be encouraged that as the song we sang earlier goes, we will all get to heaven. Everyone gets free. Everyone is liberated from pain and suffering and grief. Even and perhaps especially those of us who never knew a life without all of those things. And finally, I hope that we encourage one another, knowing that the responsibility to encourage and to console those who are facing the end is not dedicated to one specific person. I'm going to say that again. The responsibility to console and to encourage is not dedicated to one specific person, but to the entire membership of the community. Why? Because as we talked about last week, there is no such thing as an individual grief. We are designed to grieve in community. And when we treat it as a solo task, when people are abandoned to work things out alone or told that they should be over it already, then we fail to honor the God who made us to be compassionate. And for those of us who would rather grieve on our own, if we tend to our griefs only in private, we miss the opportunity to find one another anew. How many of you have had the experience of having a tough time in your life and having someone who you didn't expect to show up for you at all show up in the most amazing way. This is the time when we get to prove what it means to be a Christian. To grow collective hope from the soil of our heartbreaks, to find ourselves closer than ever to God's future, it takes the work of all of us, not just one. Friends, we serve a God with whom no labor of love is in vain. The contributions of none of us will be lost or wasted, but in fact, if we persist in paving the way for others, we have hope in the certainty and assurance that we serve a God who has already overcome death. And I hope, as we go forth and share that hope, that we don't get the message garbled. Amen.